Hello, Happy New Year to everybody. I am delighted today to introduce Professor Luke O'Neill. Luke is a world-leading immunologist and he is Chair of Biochemistry at Trinity College Dublin. He is also a leading commentator on the global scientific response to COVID-19, but I think most importantly, he has been a pillar of good sense throughout this pandemic, and his warm and very relatable manner has been a source of great comfort to the Irish people over the last 10 months. So Luke, you are very welcome to the IDA conference. I received really an enormous number of questions from colleagues across the globe. So if you don't mind, we'll do the interview by going through those questions, and hopefully it won't sound like mastermind.
That's right. It is my specialist subject after all, so I should be able to answer for you.
Good. Okay, so maybe we'll start with a few questions that came in actually about you personally. Breda from Dublin would like to know where your career started and where did your interest in immunology come from?
Yes, well, it begins in school for all of us. I had a great teacher. I'm from Bray, by the way. Bray was my school. Great guy. Mr. Mooney was my big inspiration. Did science in Trinity. And then in my final year, did a project on Crohn's disease. And that's a very important inflammatory disease. Got into inflammation, into the immune system. Did a PhD in London then, working on... I've always worked on inflammation and inflammatory diseases, I guess, from then on. I suppose there was two things. One was, it was a scientific puzzle. We still don't know the basis for these diseases, you see. It's still a mystery, even after 35 years of me working on it, many of us. And then secondly, obviously, if you make a discovery, it could be useful, couldn't it, as a new medicine kind of thing. And then, of course, when COVID came along, we work on inflammatory situations. COVID is an inflammatory disease. So my lab now has 4 projects working on COVID, for instance. Many labs all over the world, in fact, in immunology switched into COVID. So we're part of that big challenge as well, I guess.
Oh, that's great. Interestingly, Michelle from Sligo asked, how have you coped with the sheer volume of work over the last year? And how have you adjusted to life in the public eye now that you're a household name?
Yeah, that's the terrifying bit. Yes, that's the funny one. Well, as ever, I'm sure you're the same, Eileen. You organise your schedule, don't you? You know, that's how you manage your time, really. My main focus is the lab. Just this morning, I've just come from the lab. 5 people are back in the lab now again, cracking on with the research. That's the number one priority, really. The media stuff, that got much more intense, obviously. I was doing like news talk once a week for years, really. But now it's every day. There's a bit of an interview here and there. But it's not difficult, I mean, I'm an expert on the area. I'm watching every night. I'm checking things, you know, and my own research then is building on some of this stuff. So it's not that difficult. It's just a question of time management, I suppose. The thing. Getting known is a strange one because now people shout at me in the street. There's nobody in the street today, but that's a bit unnerving, maybe. But I guess it goes with the territory.
Well, you're like Prince. You're known by your first name.
My first name.
Luke,
I'm Professor Luke, which I don't like the sound of. It sounds like I'm in my 90s. No, but that's what they call me now.
Anyway, Luke, I suppose moving on then to some questions about the illness. The first one that came in from Kevin in Dublin. He wants to know why COVID is described as a mild illness for the majority of those who contract it, yet the newspaper report on long-term health effects in some cases. And what is the latest on this from a scientific perspective? Yeah, well, the good news, we know a huge amount about this virus now. Amazing. It was only described on January the 11th, so nearly a year ago. And since then, our knowledge has grown and grown. There's 100,000 publications on COVID at the moment. So a huge amount. And the answer to the first part is, if you're under about 55 or 60, your immune system is really good at fighting the virus. And you make loads of things like interferons, for instance, which are natural antiviral factors. And young people especially make buckets of this stuff. That kills the virus, really, through various mechanisms. So it's a pretty mild disease for 95% of people, which is the good news. That question, though, is so relevant. A certain percent of people may have, like, not a difficult disease, but they will turn into long COVID and they've got persistent symptoms. The numbers are, we're not fully sure. It could be as high as 1 in 3 in some studies. Certainly at the moment, 40% of people will have symptoms at least 1 month after the infection, which is a big challenge for them. One or 2 symptoms. And then a small number have very severe symptoms. Now that's a big focus because that's lots of people when you do the numbers on that. The trouble is we don't know why. I mean, it's still a mystery as to why some people transition into that more severe disease. We think it's because the immune system is off kilter. In other words, the virus is in your body,
the immune system fights it and doesn't go back to normal. It's reset, if you like, and now it's on a bit of a hair trigger. It's kind of an autoimmune thing, we think, and massive research is going into this now. Now, other diseases have this, like post-viral fatigue is a famous thing with other viruses. Anyway, Lyme disease is a big one where people have persistent symptoms beyond the infection. So again, this research on COVID may well inform us in terms of treating other diseases that involve post-infectious consequences.
No, that's really interesting. And actually, it actually links to another question from Gavin in the US. You know, he's talking again about a young and apparently healthy individuals getting sick and very sick. And he's asking, is there likely to be a genetic component to this or other markers which, you know, in a way, people could be identified as being susceptible to having an inappropriate immune response. Is that something you see? It
must be partly genetic, because why would one person develop long COVID, another not? And they're looking at that now closely. Again, with things like post-viral fatigue, you do see some genetic, they've been looking for genes for a long time and that they can't quite find them. It's probably very heterogeneous. So in other words, if you and I were unfortunate to get it, you might have one genetic variant, I could have a different one, and we wouldn't spot it in the two of us, you see. So it's a bit of a challenge to pin it down. But the other possibility is dose of virus. If you get a high dose into your system, that really irritates the immune system. And there's a higher risk then of developing long COVID. Age is a factor. People in their 50s, actually, especially women. Women seem to have more long COVID than men. That's at the moment. That's what they're concluding from the studies. And maybe a woman's immune system is different to a man's. They get it in their 50s and that goes off kilter. So it's quite a complicated thing that's so important for us to get more information on, really.
No, that's really interesting. Going back to Kevin again in Dublin, he's asking if it is likely that COVID will eventually be eradicated like some other diseases, or is it something that's going to be with us in the long term? And if it stays, is the virus likely to sort of mutate to be more benign or alternatively a bit nastier?
It will become endemic is the word we use. We've only got rid of smallpox, remember. Of all the infectious diseases that afflict humanity, smallpox is gone because of vaccination. We're very close to polio. Africa now is polio-free, which is tremendous news. Every other infection is still in the world, and people get infected by it. Now, what does endemic mean? It burns away to low level, but it's now manageable. Now, in the case of COVID, what management means is vaccination to protect people from getting sick and having a difficult course, and then therapies in hospital to treat people who do get sick, and the fear begins to go away. So we're predicting, if we're lucky, it'll be this year, it will go endemic. And now it's no longer such a fearful disease and can be managed much more effectively in our hospital system and by our doctors.
Okay, thanks, Luke. Which moves us on nicely to the hundreds of questions that came in on vaccines. And maybe a sample of a few. Anne from Galway is asking, if someone has already tested positive for COVID-19, is it not the case that they have the antibodies, and should they get the vaccine? Yeah,
the recommendation is to get vaccinated if you've been infected, because there's a risk of reinfection. That's the main reason why, of course. Although literally, this is why this is so fascinating if you're an immunologist, Eileen, or I'm so into it usually, because literally last week, a very good study from Oxford, again, Oxford seems to be leading the world with this virus, by the way, separate group to the vaccine group now, they showed that there's good evidence of a lack of reinfection. They had 12,000 people, right? Half had the infection, half didn't. It was in a hospital setting, actually. The ones who were infected didn't get reinfected. And obviously the ones who had never had it did get infected. So there's more evidence now that infection may protect you. Now, if that turns out to be the case, you wouldn't necessarily vaccinate those people. And certainly you would spare the vaccine for the vulnerable. And Kingston Mills, my great colleague in Trinity, he said this 2 days ago, and I agree with him. He spotted this paper, first sent it to me to read, actually, and it's a really good paper. So there's a chance now that if you're infected, you may not get reinfected. But we still don't know, so hence caution. And you must assume that you might get reinfected, I suppose, at the moment, the best advice that we have.
From India, Tanaz is asking, given the shortened clinical trial timelines for the vaccine development, can we be sure that there will be no long-term repercussions? And how long do you reckon the immunity will last for after vaccination? Yeah,
this is the key question that we all have, by the way, and we're very understanding of the hesitancy because it is a very fast programme, let's face it. In the US at the moment, there's vaccines in fridges not being used, I saw this morning, which is a scandal at one level. They think hesitancy is the reason. People are worried, and this is the question that comes up. It's been too fast. I can't trust that product. Now, to reassure people, I have no worries about this at all. Let's start with that bold statement. The reason it's fast is simply to do with money. They put loads of money into it. They recruited much more people to run the trial. Can you imagine running a 40,000 patient trial which is what Pfizer did. That would have taken years to recruit all the people. If you have thousands of people recruiting into the trial, you get the trial done more quickly. So it's simply a resource question is the first thing. So no worries about that. The second thing is we know from other vaccines, 2 months safety data is good. In other words, if something untoward might happen, you'll see it within the first 2 months.
Okay.
And that's what the FDA have mandated, by the way, for years. And there was no safety signal in 2 months. So therefore we can be confident that these vaccines should be safe to use. Now, the unknown is they're brand new vaccines, never tested before. We can't tell what's going to happen in a year or two's time, but we can't wait for that. So it's fully justified to deploy the vaccine now based on 2 months of safety data.
Okay, great. The next two I'll take together, if that's okay. So Siobhan from Dublin is keen to hear your explanation about why all current vaccines require 2 shots from an immunological perspective. In other words, why get 2 doses, 2 little doses rather than 1 big dose?
Yep.
And the second related question then was, to get a perspective, and this is from Kildare, the move in the UK towards the single dose providing some immunity to a lot of people versus the US perspective, give the 2 doses to a fewer number of people to get greater immunity.
Yep.
What are your thoughts on those?
It's a burning question now, and that's about supply, remember. So if supply is no problem, we needn't worry about this debate in a way. Should we wait for the second dose? Should we use up all the first dose with as many as possible in the hope that the second dose comes in? These are questions that we have, and they make us uneasy, to be honest. I don't like this debate specifically because we know the 2-dose regimen works great. That's the one you want. That's the optimum situation. On the other hand, it's an emergency. We've got to vaccinate as widely as possible. Hence, in the UK, they're going to extend to 12 weeks for AstraZeneca, for instance, just to ensure supply comes in that 12-week period, I suppose. So it's a tricky question. What we know for definite is the 2 doses best. Let's start with that.
Yeah.
And the reason for that is, and we've known for years, immunologists have been doing this, many vaccines involve 2 doses. The first dose, the best analogy I have for this is the first dose brings the players onto the field. The second dose blows the whistle and the game starts. So the second dose will really kick things off. And you get a bit of antibody in the first dose, and now the immune system is there, it's good to go. Second dose, bang, you get a big amount of antibody. Now the problem is this first level of antibody might suffice. That's what we don't know. And there's some studies showing that the first dose is actually efficacious. And in the Pfizer vaccine, within 11 days of the first dose, did a good strong antibody response. So in other words, it probably will work as a 1-dose protocol. But to be on the safe side, you go for the second dose, and that's what the data tells us. We must be led by the data. There's no data on a first dose, say months out, The other thing to say would be, if you want long-term protection, which is what we want, you need the second dose. So therefore that justifies that second dose. But the counter argument is there's an emergency. There could be this new variant spreading like wildfire. Let's vaccinate as many as we can in the hope that the second dose will come in, I guess, is the debate that's happening.
And that brings me on to a question that came in overnight from Waterford, actually, about this new variant, the South African variant. Yeah. And some media coverage that would suggest that variant actually, that the vaccine may not provide a level of immunity that you might be comfortable with.
I thought that was a bit irresponsible, that report. We don't know. We don't know. So to state that would worry people.
Scary
and we
people,
don't need to worry people at this stage. It is a possibility that variant may not be protectable against with the vaccine. But we just don't know. Yeah. I'll bet it will be, by the way, because what happens is it's all about the spike protein. That's the bit that infects your cells. And you make an immune response to the spike. Yeah. You make loads of antibodies to cover that entire spike. Yeah. A tiny change over here, an antibody won't work there, but the rest of the antibodies are still there. So they should protect. So I would think at the moment that we shouldn't worry about that for the moment. Okay. It needs to be tested, though, and it is a possibility, so it's in our minds. Yeah. But to state it so clearly to me was a little bit irresponsible, I thought, without the data to support that statement. If it turns out, of course, that the vaccine doesn't work, that's extremely important, because now we can make a variant in the vaccine. The good news there, by the way, is the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna can be changed very quickly. They reckon within 6 weeks. So let's say a virus emerges and the current vaccine doesn't work. Pfizer can tweak it, and 6 weeks later, a new vaccine is now made to protect against this new variant. And that gives us a bit of confidence that if there is a change, we should still get vaccines quite quickly against the new variant. Whoa. And while I'm on a roll, I think the last thing is the other vaccines coming down the track. Now we're talking 6 to 9 months away. They have lots of different proteins and not just the spike. So in other words, if a mutant emerges with a different spike, it's got other proteins, these vaccines will work against that.
Okay.
So in the long run, I wouldn't worry about escape mutants, we call these, by the way. It should still be possible that vaccines will work against them.
Oh, that's great. Luke, I'll move on to a few big picture questions, and I'll take two fairly long ones together, if that's okay. So firstly, from Alison and Michelle in Dublin and Donal in Waterford, all asked about the recent WHO Mike Ryan statement about COVID not necessarily being the big one. And they're asking, can you shed light on this and how we can prevent or protect against this in the future? And that links in with something that came in from Gavin in the US, asking a sort of a related question on what practical and realistic steps can be taken to avoid a similar outbreak.
Yeah.
And he then comments that he acknowledges that some early COVID-19 infections had no direct link to the Hainan seafood market, but he asks, should multi-species wet markets not be banned? And are you aware, are there likely to be any international guidelines introduced, and does the WHO or OECD have a view on this?
These are big questions.
Yeah, they're big questions, yeah.
They're very important, though, obviously. Yeah. We don't want this happening again, do we, anytime soon? I mean, in many people, there was 30 epidemiologists and virologists were asked this last week, actually, in America, to predict the future on this one. And they all said there will be a 4th of July celebration in America. It might be different. In other words, they're optimistic that once we get to July, August, September, we begin to come out of it. Now, we don't want to go back into it again. And the big question is, could there be another pandemic? Now, when people read Mike Ryan's comment, their heart sank.
Absolutely.
It's bad enough having this one. You know, this seems horrendous. And I wonder why he said it, actually, because again, if it was me, I wouldn't have said that, because people need cheering up, especially just before Christmas. But still, he's very realistic and he's very honest, and it's great to have that, I suppose, out there. The problem will be, will we see more jumping from animals into humans going on, in a sense? It's a random event. It's very hard to predict. So it's like an asteroid hitting the Earth in a way. And, you know, we've always worried about that for a long time as well. So it's very difficult to predict that happening in a rational way. Okay. We do think that with this one, it may not have been the seafood market, remember. That hasn't been proven yet. It's likely, but it's not proven. It could have been someone went into Myanmar or Vietnam, this is a current theory, and a bat infected them and they went to the seafood market, you see. So that's another possibility here. It definitely came from, well, not definitely, we're pretty sure it was bats. So if we invade the bat's territory, which is what's been happening, there's a higher risk of picking up a virus from a bat, and we've got to limit that for definite. Okay. And bats are a reservoir for coronaviruses. So they're our first concern. We've got to make sure we don't interfere with the bat's environment and interact with them as a way to avoid this. There's a massive effort going on to look at all the viruses in bats now. They reckon there could be 100,000 different coronavirus species. Really? Any one could mutate and jump into humans. It's a very random event, so it's hard to predict. But we're very conscious of this now to keep an eye on this. So I think if we kind of limit our contact with animals in the wild as best we can, the live markets can't be a good idea, can they? You know, these viruses are coming out of these live markets to some extent. So again, whether they would ban them, that's a tricky one. I'm not sure what would be the position on that. But certainly if you're very zealous, you might consider limiting those activities to prevent this happening again. Okay, that's great, Luke. And Aidan in the US is asking what Luke's opinion is on the emergence of the new variants, and is there a link between higher contagious strain and potency? In other words, more contagious, less potent, less contagious, more potent. Is there a view on that? There is, but there's a bit of information on this, obviously. Now, the variants will always arise. Yeah. There are hundreds of them already, by the way, of COVID-19 that we know about, because they keep seeing them. Because every time the virus copies itself, there's a slight error in the recipe, and you get a new variant. Now, the big question is, are any of these dangerous? Now, a good analogy here is there's 30,000 letters in the recipe to make this virus, by the way. Imagine if it's a cookbook, say you have 30,000 letters. 2 or 3 letters are changing, it doesn't change the recipe. You know, you still have a similar cake at the end of it, unless it's a key part of the recipe, maybe, you know. But because it's such a small number of changes, we don't worry about it. But we keep an eye on it. And the risk is you might get several changes. And the worry about the new variant, by the way, is lots of changes happen there in this single strain. And they're in this spike, and so we keep a very close eye on it. So now the current variant, by the way, it's still not fully clear what this is like, by the way. The evidence would be it's more transmissible. But that's mainly based on epidemiology. In other words, it goes up in a population and seems to spread more quickly. Human behaviour could be another reason for that. So it's a mix of the two, really. But at the moment, we would be unwise not to assume this is more transmissible, and therefore we have to take actions against that. But in terms of other ones arising, you've got to watch this closely. There's still a risk, low though it might be, of a new variant that makes you much more sick and this one doesn't, by the way. The current new variant doesn't make you any sicker. And there isn't any increased mortality, we think, at the moment anyway. But a new one might be more lethal, and that's something to watch very closely. And we've got great genomics, by the way, to keep an eye on this. So something that we've got to keep an eye on. But again, I wouldn't be staying awake at night worrying about it. It's a distant possibility, you see. But it's still there.
Two short ones, if I can, Luke, from people. Michelle from Sligo was asking if you think we will soon likely see breakthroughs in cancer treatments as a result of the learnings from the process of developing the vaccine, and when that's likely to come on stream. And the second one then is from Deborah in the US, asking if it is possible at this stage to see the long-term impact that coronavirus is having on autoimmune disease, diabetes type 1 or hypothyroidism. And if so, what are they? The good news in a sense is all this knowledge about this virus is teaching us more about the immune system as well. And like I worked on HIV years ago when I first became an immunologist. People may remember in the 80s, anybody who's our age. I mean, you're younger than me, and you probably don't remember HIV, but that was a big scare in the 80s, remember? We learned a huge amount about the immune system from working on HIV. These famous T lymphocytes that we know about now, they were sort of studied in HIV because the virus infects T lymphocytes. And drugs for arthritis kind of came out of that early HIV work because we can block T cells in that context. So I've no doubt all this immunology will help us for many different diseases. Now, specifically with cancer, the vaccine hope there is huge, by the way, because this RNA vaccine that Pfizer have and Moderna, that was being tested in cancer first, by the way, as a way to vaccinate against tumour antigens that are on tumour cells. And now it's working in COVID. That will ramp up the effort against cancer. There's a vaccine already for HPV, as we know. So that's a virally induced cancer, mind you. But there's hope now that technology could be used to vaccinate against cancer. Wouldn't that be a tremendous outcome from all this research on COVID, for instance? And then in terms of the virus affecting the immune system, there is a rate of autoimmunity, as I mentioned already, when you have a viral infection. And there is evidence with previous viruses that it might sort of somehow link into autoimmune disease. COVID could be similar. And again, this long COVID is one example. But again, very low numbers. I mean, in other words, viruses don't cause rheumatoid arthritis, as far as we know. But you might have exacerbation or kind of speeding up with that disease if you've been infected. But again, very low risk, and it's something that people are studying again. Okay, Luke, I think we've run out of time, but if I can ask you just before we close, I think people are sort of suffering here now. They're suffering physically, they're suffering emotionally, psychologically, and the recent upsurge has been a real downer, I think. So it would be great if you could leave us with a positive message of hope of how you see things over the next 6 months. Well, January is tough, isn't it? Let's face it. The first week in January, for crying out loud, it's not easy for any of us. And now this as well. It's horrendous, isn't it, in many ways? So, and it's a big worry. The mental health, as we know, they never downplay the mental health impact of this damn thing on people. So, but all we can, I mean, I've no doubt this is the case, by the way. My analogy recently, we're at the bottom of a pit. It's very dark at the moment, and it is. The numbers in Ireland are very worrying. There's no getting away from it, and it's very tough. So we've got to get these numbers down. If we observe Tony Holohan's dictum, stay home, limit your contacts, the numbers will begin to go down again. It'll take 2, 3, 4 weeks. We will see the consequences of Christmas, sadly, in 2 weeks' time, and it's not going to be good. We've got to get ready for difficulties there, there's no question. But then you can imagine towards the end of the month, the numbers begin to go down again. And most importantly, the vaccination part. Can you imagine if the vaccine wasn't there? It'd be unbearable at the moment. Now, we can predict what's going to happen there. And here's a really good thing I saw last night. So in the UK, they are predicting if they vaccinate the top 4 priority groups in the UK, they're similar to us. We've got a list of priorities. It's a bit different, but it's similar. If they vaccinate the 4 priority groups, and that means the healthcare workers, the elderly people, the vulnerable ones with certain diseases, these groups, by the end of February, the death rate will have gone down by 90%, they're predicting. Wow. Isn't that amazing? And this is obvious because we know these are the groups who do badly, you see. So those kind of projections, if they're real, now it's based on modelling in pinch of salt territory, we can anticipate the same thing here. And I think the biggest impact that this vaccination programme will have, it won't be herd immunity, that'll take forever.
or not quite, but take a long time. Decreased death rate, decreased hospitalizations, and decreased long COVID because people aren't getting infected. And therefore you get to sort of April, May, June time, we're back outdoors again. There'll be a perfect alignment, I think, of a massive vaccination program, back outdoors. The virus is now definitely on the run. There's no question. We now have it, in our sights to get rid of it, or not fully, but certainly, turn it into a disease that is no longer fearful. And that's the real future. And I'm very confident that that's what's going to happen.
Luke, it has been a privilege and a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thanks for all the questions.